The Moon Moth by Jack Vance. This is a Dobson edition, which is really nice with a cool piece of cover art on the jacket there. This is a collection of his short stories, and at this point I still haven't read anything by Jack Vance, so I'm excited to give him a go. I'm not sure whether I should start with his short fiction or jump straight into one of his novels. Speaking of Dobson science fiction, I picked up a copy of Ipomoea, I think that's how you say that, with again a pretty interesting design on the jacket there. This is by John Rackham, who I recently read and reviewed in The Anything Tree, which has turned out to be one of my favourite reads of the year. I've actually already finished this one because it is only 100 pages or so long, and I'll be reviewing it in an upcoming video. While we're still on Rackham then, we've got another ace double with Dark Planet by John Rackham, with this strange alien creature on the cover there, if that is going to focus. And then if you know about ace doubles, you know that you get two novellas or novels back to back. So if you flip it over, we've got another one there, and this one is The Herod Men by Nick Kamin, and I've never heard of Nick Kamin or Nick Kamin before, but this is a great piece of cover art on this one here. So I would be tempted to read both of these, because in the John Rackham ace double that I read before, I only read one side of it. I only read the Rackham story, but I would be tempted to give The Herod Men a go purely based on that cover art. One more from Rackham here then, which is The Godbirds of Glentalac, and this is actually a science fantasy collection, so there are a few stories in here. You've got that titular story, you've got In Vino Veritas by E.C. Tubb, Sealed Capsule by Ed Mackin, For One of These by Daphne Castell, and part 2 of Harry Harrison's The Plague from Space. I haven't heard of some of those authors, and I probably won't read part 2 of a story that I've not read part 1 of, but I'd potentially be interested in reading some more John Rackham. Next up, we've got The Long Tomorrow by Lee Brackett, and I've heard quite good things about this one in particular, and about Lee Brackett's writing in general. And this is a kind of post-apocalyptic novel, I think. Then we get into some SF Masterworks, which I have a decent amount of now, with The Fifth Head of Cerberus by Gene Wolfe. And actually, I have already read this one and recorded a review for it, so that will be coming out probably next week from when this video goes live. I have read a bit of Gene Wolfe in the past with The Shadow of the Torturer, but I haven't read the entirety of the Book of the New Sun, so that's something I definitely need to do, because, spoiler alert, I love this book, and I'll get into that a bit more in that video coming soon. Then we've got a book which has come highly recommended from a number of viewers after I've spoken about Philip K. Dick in the past, and this one is Dr. Blood Money, with a pretty interesting cover there, again from Philip K. Dick. And once again, this seems to be a sort of post-apocalyptic or post-nuclear story in some way, expecting some of that PKD strangeness with this one. Couple more PKDs then. We've got Martian Time Slip, and actually I've talked about how I don't really always like the covers of these SF Masterworks editions, but I don't mind this style all that much. And this is another one that when Philip K. Dick comes up, this is one of the handful of books that people tend to recommend to me. And it seems to be about a human colony on Mars. Lastly then, and one that doesn't get recommended as much when PKD comes up on the channel, and that is Time Out of Joint by Philip K. Dick. And it looks like this one is about a man living in a world that he starts to believe is all some sort of elaborate illusion. Sounds run-of-the-mill for Philip K. Dick, but his writing is never really all that predictable. This next one's an interesting one because somebody recommended it to me, I think, on my recent Cyberpunk video, and I can't remember who that was, so let me know in the comments if it was you. But this one is Dr. Adder by K.W. Jeter, and this is a really weird edition, and it's supposedly a really weird book as well. And there's no blurb on here or in here, and it just says, just another urban folktale of sordid bloodlust. Supposedly really weird, really grotesque, and potentially even a bit controversial. Next up, we've got Nova by Samuel R. Delany, and I mentioned that I'd already read The Fifth Head of Cerberus and Ipomea. I have already read Nova by Samuel Delany. I picked this one up just after receiving it, and I've read through this one and liked it. Not as much as The Fifth Head of Cerberus, but I think I'm going to review those two books back to back in the same video in a week or so. I have read some Samuel R. Delany in the past with Babel 17, which I do have in a SF Masterworks edition, and after reading these two, I do think I want to dive deeper into his work and probably jump to some of his later books where I think he gets a little bit more experimental, a little bit more abstract, a little bit more strange. So look out for the review of Nova coming up in a week or two. We've then got Isaac Asimov with The End of Eternity in this Panther edition with a cover that I can't quite make out. I'm not entirely sure what that's meant to be depicting there. And it seems to be about someone monitoring time and jumping through time and looking at cause and effect relationships. And I have to give a massive confession here because I've never actually read anything by Isaac Asimov, so I really should correct that, and this will potentially be the one that I start with. Next up, we've got Journey Beyond Tomorrow by Robert Sheckley in this Corgi edition with a pretty cool piece of cover art there. And I think that this does involve time travel in some way. I'm not particularly fond of time travel stories. There are some exceptions to that, but in general, it's not a sort of trope that has ever been particularly compelling to me personally. But I should probably read some Sheckley. I have read one or two of his short stories in the past, but I don't think I've ever read any of his longer form work. Oh, I missed out a John Rackham book, actually, because I also picked up Beanstalk by John Rackham with quite a funny piece of cover art. You've got a stand-in for He-Man on there. You've got this woman with these glowing tubes or cables coming out of her body. And it seems to be some sort of science fiction reimagining of Jack and the Beanstalk, which doesn't sound particularly great to me. But I've read two John Rackham books already and enjoyed them, so potentially I will give this one a go to at some point. Next up, we've got Timescape by Gregory Benford, and even though this cover is relatively simple, I do think that it is quite striking. And it seems to be about someone communicating with the future where the world is dying. So again, getting into some time shenanigans there, some dying Earth stuff potentially as well from Gregory Benford, who I've not read anything by, so I am always intrigued to pick up new authors. Speaking of authors that I've never read, we have a New English Library Master Series of The Paradox Men by Charles L. Harness, with an introduction from Brian Aldiss, who I think is one of my favourite science fiction authors. And it looks like this one is a Generation Starship novel, which is a trope that I am partial to. with potentially my favourite example of that being Brian Aldiss's Non-Stop, published in the US as Starship. So it probably makes sense that Aldiss is doing the introduction to this one. And then we've got another author that I haven't read, which is Wilson Tucker with The Year of the Quiet Sun, which is a very cool title with a very cool piece of cover art. And this one seems to be both a time travel story and a post-apocalyptic story in one, which I do think sounds like an interesting combination. And then we've got Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle's Oath of Fealty, and these two were obviously quite a famous duo in writing science fiction. I have read The Mote in God's Eye by Niven and Pournelle, and I think that that book is quite good. And it seems like this one is about humanity living in this enormous structure in Los Angeles, potentially reminiscent of The World Inside by Robert Silverberg or something along those lines. If you watched my video where I read and reviewed Mirror Shades, the cyberpunk anthology edited by Bruce Sterling, you'll know that potentially my favourite story in there, or at least one of them, was by an author called Tom Maddox. And I liked it so much that I went out and looked for any books by Maddox, and I landed on Halo, not to be confused with the popular science fiction video game series, but this one is about an AI gaining self-awareness and accelerating the development of humanity, potentially actually set in the same world as the short story that I read as part of that Mirror Shades anthology. And lastly then, and this is a pretty curious one, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that I am reading through Science Fiction, the 100 Best Novels list by David Pringle, and I'm about halfway through that list at this point, and I started to think, well, what am I going to do when I finish it? What's going to be my next guide through this science fiction reading journey? And many of you will be familiar with Stephen E. Andrews, the Outlaw Bookseller on YouTube, and he is the author of 100 must-read science fiction novels, which I managed to find a copy of. So this is a kind of pocketbook list, and while there is some overlap with the Pringle list, there are a number of books that are unique to this list, and I thought it would be a good challenge to jump into after finishing this one. And the copy that I found, when I flipped it open, I found that it actually has a message inside which reads, "To Chris, you've written so many dedications in my copies of your books, I never thought the inverse would happen. Thanks, Steve." So presumably, this is Stephen E. Andrews writing this message to somebody called Chris. And I know that Stephen E. Andrews was personal friends with the science fiction author Christopher Priest, and so I assume, based on this message, that this book once belonged to Christopher Priest. And I spoke to Steve about this in the comments on one of his videos or one of my videos, and it seems to be authentic, but just so that he can check this when I tag him in this video, I am going to show that message here to the camera so that you can read it and check the handwriting and the signature. And I thought about this for a while, and unfortunately Christopher Priest passed away, and like I mentioned, Steve was friends with him, and I felt a little bit uneasy about owning this, and so I asked if Steve wanted it back, given that it belonged to his late friend, and he told me that I could keep it. So thank you very much for that. If you change your mind, let me know. But like I say, once I've finished reading the Pringle list, I'm going to start ticking off the books that I haven't read in 100 must-read science fiction novels by Stephen E. Andrews and Nick Renison. So there you go, quite a varied haul today, ranging from some vintage books to some brand new SF Masterworks copies and a few odd little curiosities along the way. I have read a couple of them already and recorded reviews that will be coming up in the next week or two, so if you're interested in sticking around for those, feel free to subscribe if you haven't. Let me know if you've read any of them and whether any of them are worth bumping up on the old TBR, or if there are any in there that you would advise me to steer clear of. And so often over the last year or two, I've told myself that I need to stop buying books. And there have been a couple of points where I thought that I was over it, but at night I find myself browsing eBay and various seller websites. When I'm out and about, I find myself stumbling into charity shops seemingly against my will. And even though I do desperately need to stop buying books because I'm running out of space for them, it's costing me an arm and a leg, I just feel compelled, particularly when I'm filling out my collection of books in these lists that I'm going to be tackling on the channel. So we'll see if I can actually get a handle on this book buying habit that has gotten a little bit out of control. Thank you very much for watching, liking and subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one.